and he was known as Sarkis. He said of his ministry of 34 years, from the year 800 to 834, he said, "I have run from east to west and from north to south, preaching the gospel of Christ until my knees are weary." He worked as a carpenter, but he traveled widely, preaching, healing divisions, and just plain sharing God's love. They say that his conversion came about through his being persuaded to read the Scriptures. A believing woman came and asked him, "Why don't you read the divine Gospels?" He said, "Well, listen, only the priests are allowed to do that, not common people like me." She said, "Listen, God is no respecter of persons, but he desires that everyone be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth." And he said, "Listen," the woman said to him, "it's just a trick of the priest to deprive the people of their share in the Gospels." So he read, he believed, and he had a long and effective ministry for Jesus Christ. His letters were widely circulated and greatly valued, and the only way they could stop him was by killing him, and he ended up being cut in two by an axe by his persecutors. And so again, these men over and over again are the testimony of them, and maybe hundreds, I don't know, maybe thousands of them like them, who are unknown to history, appear time and time again in the history of the church. You know, it's claimed that between the years 842 and 867, the zeal of Theodora, this was the wife of the emperor at that time, or the empress as they called her, they said that her zeal and the zeal of her inquisitors brought about the death of 100,000 believers who were outside the institutional church. Some of these groups were called the Paulicans. This is an interesting statement. They were prepared to die for their beliefs. This is the baptismal statement of the Paulicans. They would ask them before they're baptized, "Art thou then able to drink the cup which I am about to drink, or to be baptized with the baptism which I am about to be baptized?" Because they knew something. You see, let's face it, every one of these people were baptized as babies, right? But the Paulicans recognized that baptism isn't good enough. I want to be baptized by my own free choice as a sign of my own commitment in following Jesus Christ. But before they would allow such ones to be baptized, they would ask them this question: "Are you ready? Are you prepared?" And this would be the reply they would be required to give. They would say, "I take on myself scourgings, imprisonment, tortures, reproaches, crosses, blows, tribulations, and all temptations of the world, which our Lord and intercessor in the universal and apostolic Holy Church took upon themselves and lovingly accepted them. So even do I, an unworthy servant of Jesus Christ, with great love and ready will, take upon myself all these until the hour of my death." Do you understand what a heavy thing it was to be baptized as a Paulican in these days when the institutional church was so strong and so oppressive? Well, later on, you could talk about in the 9th century in Bulgaria, there was a group of people called the Bogomils, a Slav name meaning the friends of God. These people were, again, radical followers of Jesus Christ. One of these leaders was a guy named Basil, who through his continuing practice as a physician, ministering to people, earning his living that way, he set a good example, and by that he rebuked the lazy lives of so many priests. Basil was invited to speak to the emperor about these things, and when he was alone with the emperor, he spoke to him very freely and passionately about Jesus and about the Christian life. Suddenly, the emperor opened a curtain and revealed a scribe that had written down every word that Basil had just said. And they used his words as evidence against him. They threw him into prison where he stayed for 8 years, refusing to deny the truths that he had told the emperor. Then he was publicly burnt at the Hippodrome in Constantinople. The emperor's daughter described all of these events with satisfaction. She said that Basil was a lanky man with a sparse beard, tall and thin. And she said, "Oh, how the fire crackled when Basil burned, and when he turned his eyes from the sight of the flames, and how he shook when they took him to the fire." You see, in those persecutions that followed after the Bogomils, the princes laughed at their low origins and how they looked like peasants and commoners, and how they had the habit of bowing their heads and mumbling something with their lips before they would die. Well, of course, they were praying. They were seeking God in their great hour of need. One of these, a guy named Cosmas, this Bulgarian presbyter, writing at the end of the 10th century, he describes Bogomils as worse than horrible demons. And he denied their belief in the Old Testament or the Gospels and said they prayed no honor to the Mother of God nor to the cross. They revile the ceremonies of the church and all church dignitaries, and they call Orthodox priests blind Pharisees, say that the Lord's Supper is not kept according to God's commandment, and that the bread is not the body of God but ordinary bread. And to most of that we say right on. This business about not believing in the Old Testament or the Gospels is probably bogus, right? But everything else on the list is probably true. They pay no honor to the Mother of God. They were disgusted by the Mary worship of their times. Nor to the cross. They were disgusted by this veneration of the crucifix and how people worshipped it in an idolatrous way. They revile the ceremonies of the church and all church dignitaries. They call Orthodox priests blind Pharisees. Well, they were probably right. They say that the Lord's Supper is not kept according to God's commandment and that the bread is not the body of God but ordinary bread. Yeah, right on. They didn't believe in transubstantiations or other such strange doctrines. You see, these people, though they were criticized, they were godly people. Then there were other people such as Nestorians. The Nestorians were Eastern Christians who were apart from the Eastern Orthodox Church. They were basically Orthodox in their belief, but they did differ over how the human and divine natures of Jesus combined. We wouldn't agree with Nestorian theology on that point. But listen, I think that as much as I can tell, they were real believers. Real believers with a little bit of a goofy doctrine. But what really got them into trouble was not their strange belief about how the human and divine natures of Jesus combined. What got them into trouble was that they wanted to swim outside of the stream of the institutional church. But they had a very, very broad missionary work reaching, indeed, all the way to China. They were a radical group of people. Matter of fact, when Robert Morrison in the 1900s was learning Chinese in London before going out for the London Missionary Society for his great work of translating the Bible into Chinese, he was shown and studied a Chinese manuscript that had been found in the British Museum, and that had contained a harmony of the Gospels, the Book of Acts, the Pauline epistles, and a Latin Chinese dictionary, supposedly the work of an unknown Roman Catholic missionary of the 16th century. In the Chinese annals, after a long description of the Ming Dynasty, this comment is made. A native from the great western ocean came to the capital who said that the Lord of heaven, Jesus, was born in Judea and is identical with the old country of Caesar in Rome, that this country is known to the historical books that have existed since the creation of the world for the last 6,000 years, that this is beyond the dispute of the sacred ground of history and the origin of all worldly affairs. This stuff came from the Nestorian missionary work in China so many hundreds of years ago. So there arose movements of genuine Christians in Europe. Sometimes they were influenced by one another. Sometimes they were influenced by earlier groups. Sometimes they arose from within the Roman Catholic Church as people got right with God. Prominent among such teachers were guys like Pierre de Bruez and Henry, and then another group known as the Albigenses. The Albigenses were very, very wonderful believers. Among the people, they called the Albigenses the good men. And there's general testimony to the fact that their manner of life was an example to everybody. Especially, and they lived in the same kind of way that Francis of Assisi did, with simplicity and godliness. And it was a real contrast to the self-indulgent lives of the clergy. They were called the Albigenses because the name was taken from the region of Albi, a district where many of them, but not all of them, came from. These people were inquired by Pope Innocent III, and then another one, Raymond VI, who ruled in Provence, and of the other rulers and prelates of the south of France, that they were heretics that should be banished. They were reluctant to do so, but eventually the Pope declared a crusade against heretics of religion in 1209. For example, this is how they carried out the persecution against people like the Albigenses. They said, after the capture of another place, La Minever, about 140 believers were found, women in one house, men in another, engaged in prayer as they awaited their doom. De Montfort had a great pile of wood prepared and told them to be converted to the Catholic faith or mount the pile. They answered that they owed to papal or priestly authority only that to Christ and His Word. Therefore, they owed nothing to papal or priestly authority, only to that to Christ and His Word. The fire was lighted, and the confessors, without hesitation, went into the flames. Now, is that radical? But again, this is what I want you to know. Even though it is not commonly known, even though it's not commonly talked about, even though it's oftentimes lost to history, there were true believers existing, living, loving God, spreading the gospel, and very, very often suffering death for their faith throughout this time when it seems so dark in the medieval church. One of them, an inquisitor named Renenerus, he died in 1259. This is what is the record he left of his investigation of these kind of sects. He said, concerning the sects of the ancient heretics, observe that there have been more than 70, all of which, except for the sects of the Manichaeans and the Arians and the Runcarians and the Leonists, which have infected Germany, have through the favor of God been destroyed. Do you see what he says? There's been all of these ones, and almost all of them have been destroyed. Among all these sects, which either still exist or have formerly existed, there is not one more pernicious to the church than the Leonists. And this is for 3 reasons. Okay, he's going to describe to you the reasons why the Leonists were so dangerous, so bad, and so worthy of destruction. Okay, what are the 3 reasons? Number 1, the first reason is because it has been of longer continuance, for some say that it's lasted from the time of Sylvester, other from the time of the apostles. Well, I imagine it probably lasted from the time of the apostles, right? So that's his first argument. It's been around a long time, which isn't really an argument at all. Secondly, the second reason, because it is more general, for there is scarcely any land in which this sect does not exist. Do you see how widespread they were? You see, there were true believers all over the place, but they're basically lost to history. And the third reason? The third reason is because while all other sects, through the enormity of their blasphemies against God, strike horror into their hearers, this of the Leonists has a great semblance of piety, inasmuch as they live justly before men and believe every point well respecting God together with all the articles contained in the creed. Only they blaspheme the Roman Church and the clergy, to which the multitude of the laity are ready enough to give credence. Do you see what he's saying? He's saying there's nothing wrong with their doctrine. They just don't like the institutional Roman Catholic Church, and that is why they must be destroyed. You know, the more you study it, the more you look at it, you just realize what an amazing thing it was to have this Pilgrim church throughout the centuries. And you have other groups. You have the Waldensians and their great works. You have works all over Europe where they did their great work and where they honored God. Again, for the most part, lost to history. So we really can't give a proper history of these movements. And oftentimes, the only thing we have to say about them, we know from their accusers. But we know enough to say that God's genuine witness, that God's church did not perish from the earth, even in the days when the Roman Catholic Church looked so corrupt. Of course we know that there must have been some true believers within the Roman Catholic Church. But there were probably, by far, many, many more true believers in these groups outside of the Roman Catholic Church, in what we might call the Believers' Church or the Pilgrim Church. It's a wonderful testimony to us about how God keeps His witness alive, and what Jesus said was true, that He would build His church and that the gates of hell would not prevail against it.